A large part of the story also revolves around the idea of women in military service, where the culture portrayed has the entrenched view that militarism is a distinctly male profession. In story, there's a variety of rules and opinions stated about how women are to serve. Women are to be marked as auxiliaries, which is supposed to entail not commanding any man, even of lower rank. They are not to participate in firing rifles or loading cannons, and quite bizarrely are expected to be offloaded prior to any engagement with the enemy, notwithstanding the enemy's lack of accommodation. Meanwhile, the characters we meet give a range of opinions on viewing and treating women in military service. Some characters have more respect for women as equal soldiers, while others may abide their presence and command but prefer women not be part of the military. And most obviously, those who straight up reject women in military roles give a variety of reasons and arguments to this end, the validity and congruence of those arguments notwithstanding. Let me preface this by saying, first of all, that as I personally am not a woman, nor have I any military service experience, I cannot speak with authority on how women in military service affects either the military, the women, and more broadly society at large in real life. What I feel I can do is make some educated guesses based on some first principles and work backwards to theorize as to what values are being served when certain arguments are made on the matter, both in story and possibly in real life. Suffice it to say, my opinions, arguments, and logic are far and away less credible than the tangible life experiences and dispositions of real women in real military service, past, present, and perspective for the future. In the story, what dominates the pathos of the story, before the action gets started, is the ideas of Garnia's various sections of society on what women present in the military means for military power. The most vocal and at first most prolific voices on the matter are expressed by the Garnian General Fearon and his nephew ne'er-do-well turned accomplice Burnett, as they object to and then conspire to destroy Josette's military career. In the minds of Garnia's military administration, as recalled by Josette when she was bestowed auxiliary rank, women cannot be burdened with command, lest they be overcome with womanly hysteria, and military power is lost as a result. Another notion is that a woman outranking a man demands the woman use discretion when giving orders. Burnett himself draws up several lines of thinking in his initial campaign of smearing Captain Josette. They range from the sentiment that men in the services would themselves forbid women from serving, that women in command would be abusive of such power, or be petulant with entitlement, also describing certain commands as a fit of pique, or ascribing a paranoia for the male organ, depending on context. He also writes an argument that military service under a woman's command would take away women's femininity, just as his uncle the general believed having women serve takes away the army's masculinity. All these arguments meant to satisfy General Fearon's disdain of Josette and degrade her reputation with the print media, all draw upon ideas of a distinct boundary between femininity and masculinity, and that martial or military power can only be increased with men serving. The various dispersions cast on Josette also alternate between viewing women as tyrannical with authority over men, or for women under command as infantile with their femininity needing protection from war. It also plays into tropes portrayed and examined outside the story, even in real life, of the idea that women must primarily be homemakers, and where military service is concerned, be faithful and chaste until the man returns. If the war depicted expands to become a total war, then women may be employed in manufacturing to make up for the men going to fight, at least until the war ends and the men come home. Even when concerning the trope in fiction where a nation with traditional values is pushed to employ women in the military for one reason or another, there's the idea that the women must have unique protection, if not in policy, then inevitably in practice, lest they suffer a uniquely heinous assault by the enemy. In real life, it's called the Dulcinea effect, after the title character Don Quixote, who goes saving women he's only just met, on the pretext that, as a woman, they need his protection. Circumstances be damned. In the real-life military context, it's used to describe male soldiers taking on more hazardous and lethal risks for the sake of saving their fellow soldiers because they're women. The idea goes hand in hand with the other ideas that what befalls men in war is somehow worse when it happens to women, and that men are somehow more expendable than women. In story, it explains why Garnia would have a policy of offloading female personnel before a fight, even if it can never be fulfilled without compromising military readiness. What advocates of these enforced gender roles, both fictional and in real life, usually neglect to consider is that these ideas and opinions of gender roles in military life are not usually the duly considered aggregate disposition of the women concerned. For all the reasons a person may consider when deciding to join the military, go off to war, and risk life and limb in deadly combat, and then try and make do with what's left of themselves if and when they survive their tours of duty, or otherwise conclude their military careers, the difference between facing all of this as a man or a woman really should be considered irrelevant, at least in my opinion. Even if the requirements and demands of military service mean there will be, quote-unquote, inevitably more men than women, that shouldn't be a call for extra stigma or privileged treatment, much less a disparagement towards either the women for not being feminine a la enlisting, nor the men for not being masculine on account of women enlisting. In parallel, the policies that military service demands, which at any point in history called on more men than women, themselves change, because the nature of war changes, such that what made the biological differences between men and women relevant to war no longer hold the same relevance. For anyone decrying the degradation of gender roles lest women join in the masculine profession of militarism and soldiering, I want to point out one real historical example to highlight how what was considered masculine and what was militarily useful and expedient was not and is not limited to what is considered traditional now, especially when what is called traditional does not reach so far into the depths of history. The one example I'd like to bring up for my own opinion is the example of modern popular culture's perception of the ancient Greeks. First of all, and more specifically, the Spartans. The Spartans are considered today an exemplar of military prowess, as an extension of pure masculinity, specifically our more current sense of masculinity. We characterize these Spartans as masters of efficient killing in battle, and masters of waging war, and we decided this was because of training from an early age to inflict and suffer pain without losing the will to fight. Such was this accomplishment that the Spartans are said to have had no walls but the rows of their hoplite shieldmen, and their borders not but the tips of their spears. What is inconvenient for current advocates of masculinity as a tie to militarism is that they would have rejected the real-life Spartans' people's soldiery, for a significant part of their culture was driven by their homosexuality. From this amateur's perspective of ancient Greek culture, I can only suppose women were not held in high regard, so they would hold even less relevance where military culture is concerned. Whereas today, calling someone, even a soldier, a boy lover would be a straight up insult, to the ancient Greek Spartans, it would be a high compliment. What isn't usually appreciated is that the Spartans didn't hold on to their prestige and prowess forever, and not by way of their traditionally assigned rival in modern popular culture, the Athenians. Rather, the Spartans knew military defeat at the hands of the ancient Greek Thebans. In particular, the military unit known as the Sacred Band, a group of soldiers specifically and purposefully composed of homosexual male couples. Their cohesion as a fighting force was renowned on account of their love for each other, and so too was their ferocity upon the fall of their lovers. This, among other factors, in time brought down the Spartans' power in ancient Greece. In the context of our story, where the crew of the Mistral is expected, as a policy of the Aerial Signal Corps, not to be married or get married on pain of dismissal, speaks to distinctly different ideas as to how gender roles serve or hinder military aims. In story, we can presume that married couples would be a distraction on board crewed vessels, or else in the same military units and formations, where their duties to perform would be hindered on account of attention to a spouse being endangered by combat. In real history, by contrast, the military aims of a state like the ancient Greeks may indeed be well served by couples facing combat together, maintaining cohesion fit to keep fighting together, and never breaking under pressure, or else be driven to fight harder by revenge of a hurt or fallen lover. This is just one example, and there will certainly be more to find for any proficient student of history, to illustrate that the gender roles we implicitly agree to and the roles of gender that serve military doctrines are really just as fluid as the roles of gender or the definitions of gender themselves. As far as Garnia and Vinsalia are concerned in story, another voice concerning women and the military is duly summarized when Jutes is assembling a crew, looking over recruits, and expresses his apprehensions concerning the women candidates. When trying to impress on the candidates the dangers of aerial military service, he openly offers that any women not willing to face the hazard can better serve the army as prostitutes. Whether his is a sincere sentiment or simply to motivate the least resolved women to leave is besides the point. Where military force is concerned, depending on the culture, keeping a purposefully all-male army requires satisfying the unique requirements of that army. Between a society that's fully egalitarian between men and women, and one that makes women into property of their male family members, the society depicted in story is somewhat closer to the women as property compared to our modern society, depending on where you look. Even if women are not explicitly depicted as chattel in story, there may still be an attitude that a woman has to satisfy a man's needs above all. And if a woman is unavailable on account of a man being at war, then the culture may teach the fighting men that victory guarantees access to women and their service, either from opportunistic sex workers or from women of conquered settlements. If two societies are at war and have a similar appraisal of women, then it helps explain how rules may be made to dictate that women are not allowed to wield weapons, serve in the army, and must be evacuated before combat commences, or else hidden away. Serving with the army in a society such as these exposes women to being accosted, harassed, assaulted, and even raped by her own compatriots that get the idea that they deserve that kind of attention. Alternately, women present in the military, where men think they're owed attention, is a good way to foster jealousy, resentment, and outright strife in a way that really affects unit cohesion. You can see this attitude as a base for old superstitions such as women present on ships is bad luck, because strife between crew members over a woman's attention can be damaging to their operation. What advocates of barring women from military service or combat roles neglect in their arguments is that this isn't the fault of the women. It's the result of the men being taught to think of women as fundamentally and primarily for the men, rather than equal in their rights, protections, and the conviction of their commitments. We see Jute's in-story explicitly worrying about the women on board Mistral potentially causing jealous strife among the crew in just this way. It also ties into understanding a society that views women as tools of political and economic advantage through alliance of families. In such a society, patriarchies would not want to risk women being lost to military service when they can be used for more profitable ends. From the other side, conquering an enemy gives incentive to take compensation from the enemy by taking their women, especially against their will. It also ties into the class divisions that have these views of women and make the rules thusly to spare high-born women from the ravages of war, while leaving lower-class women to their own means for defense against enemies looking to take them as spoils of war. In such a culture, women serving in the military risks having them marred or lost in war and battle. Again, another reason for the rules such as don't fire weapons and be safely dropped off before battle. Now consider a society that's transitioning away from regional, more fractional rule by patriarchal families, essentially trading women in feudal, medieval, or post-medieval alliances, and more towards centralized national governments, where wealth is more distributed among classes of merchants, tradesmen, and other skilled labor, independent of noble families. In such a different society, women need not be commodified because gaining wealth doesn't require marrying women off to another family for advantage. The difference in military organization and doctrine for a more central national government is that such an army needs to be more professional and permanent, and not simply who can afford their own arms and armor, and make their own way when their local monarch calls. Unlike a rabble that needs to be promised spoils of war in order to fight for a local feudal lord, the soldiers of a professional standing army need promise of steady pay in order to be on call to serve the needs of the larger state. Where this concerns women in a military context is that the state now has different incentives for employing anyone in the military. Whomsoever has the knowledge, training, technical skill, and leadership will be valuable to military service, women included. In a society where women are not as much commodity for noble ruling families, they'll be of great worth to a national state for their productivity in civilian life and their professional service in the military. It explains in story why Josette's commission to captain the Mistral comes not from the current military administration, but from higher up the government ladder, from the king of Garnia himself. In a society where a king is allowed or expected to be transgressive and innovative as an extension of their divine right to rule, and even despite the conservative notions of their populace, one innovation a king might recognize is the need to invest the value of the nation's military service into as many people across the nation as possible. As far as a professional, standardized standing military is concerned, what worked in medieval times simply won't suffice when war is changed by advancing technology and society's industry. When arms were forged individually, required unique individual skill to wield effectively, and fighting was done according to the abilities of individual fighting men, then women would be far unlikely to be a part of that military structure because the individual fighters needed to be trained from as early an age as possible to become as skilled as possible in fighting a war. Meanwhile, the noble women would be raised to be proper ladies, fit for marriage to a male member of another noble family, and also be fit to manage the feudal household, including its defense. What is often overlooked about the idea of women staying in the house is that it has its origins in medieval society, where it was noble women that controlled and often enough protected the house by command of the guards, while all the other peasant women in feudal society worked the land with the peasant men. And a medieval war between feudal lords would not only involve the nobility and their individually acquired arms and armor, but also non-noble men-at-arms that would have to make do with lesser resources to acquire simpler, more numerous combat equipment. Additionally, while the nobles would be privileged to train and indulge themselves in war and war-adjacent activities, the decidedly more peasant-like men-at-arms would have to disrupt their feudal peasant lives to become soldiers for the nobles' pursuits. Their only consolation may be to loot wealth from civilians upon victory, including taking their women. A woman trying to make their way as a soldier in this system would likely have to make do with less training in between other women-assigned chores. Even if proficient in fighting, she couldn't take the same spoils as her male counterparts. She'd just as likely have to kill her potential prize lovers on account of them being enemy men meaning to kill her, and at the same time having to fend off the unwanted attention of deprived men on her own side. In this system, allowing women to fight would be considered foolhardy and wasteful, not counting the unique perils the women would be exposed to, and the apathy towards her well-being when she is not noble. However, matters change when the state and military situation changes. With advances in weapons technology, physical ability becomes far less demanding. A soldier wielding a sword with strength and agility is no longer as effective as a more moderately fit one using a more powerful firearm. With advances in industry, mass production, and interchangeability of parts for equipment, more soldiers of a standing army can be armed at once, with quality independent of a recruit's ability to pay. With a larger civilian population that is wealthier and more prosperous than peasants, more soldiers can be supported on a reliable salary from taxes than can be attracted by the promise of war spoils. And with larger armies standing ready to fulfill the state's military objectives, unit cohesion, professionalism, technical competence, and readiness are more important than the prestige and unique strength of individuals blessed with mythical strength or noble birthright. In just such a system, what physical difference made a woman less desirable as a soldier, or in other military service, is decidedly less relevant. When a knight, singular in their strength and stamina, born of the noblest blood, armed and armored with the best that money can buy, can be killed by a soldier who is physically unexceptional in every way but is armed with a firearm and is part of a larger unit working together for their strength in arms, then gender really is no object. The bullet doesn't care for the nobility of the blood, nor the femininity or masculinity of neither the target nor the shooter, where its ability to kill is concerned. The demands of military service then require the attributes of a soldier that are certainly attainable to women, which is far better when the society itself allows for wealth to be attained independent of women as commodities. And there's no shortage of roles that need to be satisfied with a standing army. It's no longer as simple as a group of armed men fit to forage, scavenge, loot, and carry their own supplies with them, but for armies that bring their own supply procured from their own nation's industry. Serving in the military requires just as much support as fighting ability. In real life, this metric is called a tooth-to-tail ratio, which is the ratio of soldiers that directly fight the enemy to the personnel that supports the soldier's ability to fight. An army travels on its stomach, so people are needed to procure, transport, and prepare the food needed to feed an army's march. In turn, a substantial number of people are needed to organize the logistics required to procure, transport, and distribute ordnance, ammunition, fuel, and other essentials to fighting a war. Were it not for vastly underappreciated quartermasters, for example, the military glory of soldiers, sailors, and flyers would not be possible. More importantly, a number of dedicated professional soldiers, well drilled and armed and well supplied and supported from their nation, can best an even greater number of soldiers supported only by their own plunder. In this system, women would be well worth induction into supporting the military system, because that system operates best when it can draw on the widest possible pool of people qualified in the knowledge and skill needed to support its logistics and organization. Moreover, as military technology and the manner of war moves further away from the need for physical strength of the soldiers, so too will there be a greater need for greater technical acumen, and a nation's military likely cannot and will not afford to leave out anyone, much less women. Where victory in military operations is concerned, blades, bullets, and bombs aren't shy of tits. Thus, for women who want to serve, the state and military shouldn't be shy of tits either.